Welcome to chapter 6. So we will discuss different methods of process synchronization in this chapter. So specifically we will discuss some of the most common algorithms for what is called mutual exclusion and semaphores. So first we will give a little bit of the background. Then we will discuss the critical section problem and software and hardware solutions for critical sections. Then we'll extend the concept of critical sections to semaphores and monitors. And finally, a little bit of theory, safety and liveness, and a little bit of practice. So what is the critical section problem? So the critical section problem is basically where something that we have seen previously, that we have the same variable and a conflicting and concurrent access is made. And because of that, there are problems. So what kind of problems we'll see later in the chapter. But it's important that there are conflicting accesses. Conflicting means that one of the accesses is a write, and concurrent means they happen at the same time. Alright. So we'll discuss various solutions in software and in hardware to tackle this problem. So the background is that many processes can execute concurrently. And furthermore, if a process is executing, it can be interrupted at any time. Any instruction, it can be interrupted. Then for a very long time, it can cease to execute. And a long time later, it can start. So long time, of course, in a CPU scale, something like 2 seconds is very long. 1 hour, very long. So as I said, anything that we perceive, that is very long at the CPU time scale. So then, a variety of problems can happen. So we have already seen one example of a problem, the bounded buffer problem, where we saw that if the counter variable is concurrently updated by the producer and the consumer, then it leads to what is called a race condition, which is clearly problematic. This is not something that we want, right? So this is clearly problematic, and this we have seen in chapter 4. So what we will do is, we will look at many more examples of such race conditions in this chapter. So let us assume that processes P0 and P1 are creating child processes using the fork system call. So here is what can happen. Let's say that there is a kernel variable, the next available process ID, which represents the next process ID that can be taken, and both P0 and P1 fork at the same time. Both of them request for a new process ID, a new PID. And the next available PID is, let's say, 2615. So if, let's say, without any form of synchronization, both the kernel threads simply return this value, we will have two processes that have exactly the same PID, which is not acceptable. So we want one of these requests to wait, the other one to proceed. And then, of course, one gets 2615, the other will get 2616. So there has to be some mechanism to prevent P0 and P1 from accessing the same variable at the same point in time. So what is the critical section problem? So let us assume that we have n processes which are numbered from P0 to Pn-1. So then what we do is we consider a critical piece of code that changes common variables, in the sense it changes variables that are shared. So we demarcate a piece of code that changes shared variables, like the piece of code that was updating the counter variable, or the piece of code that will update the request PID variable, the next PID variable in the previous slide. So what this says is that we demarcate a block of code, and when one process is entering it, the other process cannot enter, it's going to wait. Right? So only one of the processes can execute instructions in the critical section at any given point in time. So of course, how do we enter a critical section? We need to get permission. So it is demarcated by two functions, lock and unlock. Alright. So the general structure would be, we have a critical section. There is an entry and an exit. The entry function, we have been calling it lock. And the exit function, we have been calling it unlock. So far so good. So what are the requirements for a solution to implement a critical section? The first is mutual exclusion, which means that if one process is executing the critical section, the CS, no other process is there in the CS. Alright. So that is obvious, which means that this is like a room, it's kind of like a bank locker where if let's say one person is there inside, another person cannot enter the room with lockers. The next is progress, which means that let's say if there is no process which is currently in the critical section and one process is desirous of entering the critical section, so then it means that this process should be allowed to enter within a finite time bound. It cannot be postponed indefinitely. It cannot be asked to wait indefinitely, which basically, so this is also called obstruction freedom in the theoretical literature. I'm not getting into that. But what it essentially says is that, look, if the critical section is empty and if a process wants to get into the critical section, you just cannot stop it. It needs to get in. Furthermore, there is something called bounded waiting. What bounded waiting says is that a bound must exist on a number of times that other processes are allowed to enter the critical section after a process has made a request. So this essentially means that if let's say a process has made a request, there is no starvation. That's what this means. So it means that, look, if I have made a request within a certain amount of time, it can either be bounded or it can be finite, but clearly it's not infinite. I should get access to the critical section. It should never be the case that, I am waiting and other processes are simply entering and exiting the critical section and I am simply waiting. Of course, they might be running on faster cores with higher frequencies. It doesn't matter. As far as I am concerned, I do not want any starvation. So there is a name for this. This is the property 2 is called obstruction freedom, in the sense that, look, if there is no obstruction, in the sense nobody is occupying the critical section, I should be allowed to get in. And the other is, if I have made a request, regardless of whatever is happening in the rest of the process world, within a finite amount of time, I should be allowed into the critical section, right? So no starvation. So one is an interrupt based solution which works well for unicore systems. So basically the idea is that when on a single core, let's say there are multiple processes, it doesn't matter. If let's say I enter the critical section, okay, what I do is that I have some way of figuring out that who wins, and then within the critical section I disable interrupt. So this basically means that I cannot be swapped out. Otherwise what will happen is that, let's say some interrupt comes, this process gets swapped out, then forever, and let's say it gets swapped in a long time later. So till that point of time the critical section is taken. So you basically do not want any swap outs when a process is in the critical section. So for that what you do is you disable interrupts and then you enable them. So this is a very standard solution for preventing swap outs in critical sections. And the key idea is that if the code runs for an hour, well, the code might be a 2-second code, but it could be that within the critical section it got swapped out. So to avoid that, we disable and quickly re-enable interrupts. So this is one thing that is definitely done in these interrupt service routines, where in any interrupt service routine, it is, you are not allowed to enter a critical section. So you are not allowed to do a lock and unlock. And furthermore, we also don't want anybody to disrupt the execution of an interrupt service routine, even though it's not a critical section. So what is done is that when we enter an interrupt service routine, we typically disable all interrupts, and then when we exit it, we enable, because we want the entire block of code to execute atomically, which means either all of it executes or none of it executes. Alright. So I'm throwing many terms, but the nice thing with the video is that you can always go back to the point and you can replay it. So if there are two CPUs, then we need a better solution. In a single CPU, of course, the things are much easier. What happens is that we have a single CPU, so there is clearly will not have the issue with concurrent requests. So whoever goes to the lock variable, that person can simply deposit itself in a queue. And to ensure that any such action happens, all that you need to do is disable interrupts, right? So remember, there is a single CPU. So for entering a critical section, you disable interrupts and then you enable. So let's say that the way that we implement a critical section will be very easy. We'll have a queue of processes, and let's say a new process wants to enter this. So what it will do is that first, when it is executing, it is sure that other cores are not there. So it will disable interrupts. It will insert itself into the queue, and then it will enable interrupts. Okay. Now let's say whichever process is executing the critical section, when it leaves, when it calls the unlock function, the unlock function will basically go to the kernel. Again, it will disable interrupts, it will enable interrupts. It will dequeue the queue, and it will find the process at the head of the queue, and that process will be scheduled to run on the processor. So as you can see, it is very easy to operate on any shared variable and ensure that no other process is coming in between, because when you are considering a single core, the only way that another process can come in between is via an interrupt. In the sense, an interrupt arrives and the other process is scheduled. But if we disable interrupts and there is a single core, then we can ensure that a certain piece of code executes without any interference, because the only way of interfering is to actually interrupt and swap some other process in. But given the fact that interrupts are disabled, this possibility does not exist. Alright. So what I said here is slightly complicated, so it may be worth a quick clarification. So what I said over here is slightly tricky. So what I said is that, look, if you have a single processor system, okay, then the lock and unlock functions become reasonably simple. The way that you would implement a lock function is that you would first disable interrupts. So let's say, let this line stand for it, I'm not writing. Then you will enqueue the process ID into a queue, and then you will enable interrupts. Alright. And of course you will check if the queue, let's say the queue is empty or not. If it is empty, it basically means that no process is in the critical section. So you can directly get in and by enqueuing yourself first. But let's say that if there are other processes, then you simply wait. When you unlock, essentially you do the same. Again, disable interrupts. You dequeue the head of the queue, and that process is swapped in. Alright. So the only way that this code can break is if another process comes in the middle and then it tries to access the queue at the same time. But this is not going to happen. The reason it's not going to happen is that in a single processor system, the only way for another process or thread to come in is via an interrupt mechanism. And since interrupts have been disabled, no chance of this happening. But given the fact that this is a generic mechanism, this is also used in interrupt service routines, which incidentally are prohibited from participating in any critical sections. The only reason being is that they might be indefinitely delayed because the other thread is not leaving the critical section. So, but they still use the same mechanism where they disable interrupts, they do their work, and then you enable them. The reason is that particularly when you are dealing with hardware, we do not want to do half a job. We want to finish the job. We don't want to be interrupted in the middle. That is why this generic enable disable mechanism is used by other kinds of code as well. So when we come to a two process solution, okay, then there is an issue. Okay. So the issue is that it is very hard to synchronize. So let us go with a simplistic assumption for the time being that the load and store machine instructions are atomic. So what exactly atomic means is a very long discussion, and courses in advanced computer architecture go on for weeks trying to explain the memory coherence and consistency business. But in this case, we will not go that far. We will discuss a few software solutions. The hardware assumption, of course, here is that let's assume load and stores are atomic. And atomic in this case means that from the point of view of all cores, either a load happens or it does not, either a store happens or it does not, right? And it appears to happen instantaneously. Let two processes share a variable in turn, and the variable turn would indicate who is going to enter the critical section. So let's take a look at the code. So let us now look at one solution which is not totally correct, but it will take us in the line of the solution, the final solution. So let us assume that the first box over here is the lock function, and the second box over here is the unlock function. So we'll consider two processes I and j. So of course from process i's point of view, j is the other process. So basically I in this case, in this example, basically means that I am process I and other process is j. And for the other process j, internally this code will mean that again I am process I and the other process is j. So that said and done, the first line of let's say process I would look like, while turn is equal to j, you wait, right? Don't do anything, go in an infinite loop. So what this basically means for us is that as long as it is the other process's turn, I just let it go, okay? And I just allow it to finish its work and I say that I am done. Then we execute the critical section. And after executing the critical section, we set turn equal to j. Once more, so this means that if the other process does not access the lock, then again we will come back here at a later point in time. And again we will say that turn is equal to j. So we'll again wait until j finishes the access. But the main problem with this piece of code, the reason why it is incorrect, is that during the same time, if j has not really finished its access and set turn equal to I from our point of view, then this piece of code will become incorrect. And there is a possibility that we might keep on looping forever. So to stop this, to ensure that this piece of code is correct, what we actually do is that we add a few more variables, not just the turn variable, but a few more to ensure both bounded waiting as well as progress. So what we do is we consider a two-process solution. So of course we are making an assumption that loads and stores are atomic. Atomic means that they appear to execute instantaneously. So most practical systems, practical machines are, by the way, not atomic. But of course loads and stores, the load and store instructions have variants that make them atomic. Furthermore, we say that the processes share two variables, turn and an array, a boolean array called flag. So the two processes 0 and 1 essentially treat the flag as saying I am interested. So flag I equal to true basically means that the ith process is interested in acquiring the lock. And the variable turn of course indicates whose turn it is to enter into the critical section. So the code is very simple. So this piece of code is, by the way, correct, where we have a lock function, 3 lines, and a single unlock function. So unlock function, if you see, is very simple. It's just saying that look, I am not interested. But the lock function is far more interesting. So the first line of the lock function is saying flag I is equal to true, which is essentially saying that I am process I and I am interested. Fine. Then it says, however, since I am a good process, I will allow process J to execute. So as I said, this is an altruistic algorithm. And almost all such algorithms are altruistic algorithms when you want to help the other process. So as long as process J is interested and it is process J's turn, I don't do anything, I just wait. That's all. So I first indicate my interest, then I set turn equal to J, and as long as flag J and turn is equal to J, let J execute, finish its critical section. Till that point I wait, and after that I am guaranteed to enter into the critical section. So even though this piece of code is actually, it looks simple, but it is actually not that simple when we try to prove it. So let us now prove this algorithm. So I'll just quickly write down the statements once again quickly. So the statements are like this, that flag I, let's say, is equal to 1, 1 being true, turn is equal to J, then comes the while loop, while as long as the other process is interested and it is the other process's turn. Okay. So what I do is I wait. So this is all that I have to the lock function. So let us now assume that I have two processes, process 0 and process 1. So let me assume to the contrary that both of them enter the critical section at the same time, or both of them are found to be in the critical section, thus violating mutual exclusion at the same time. So let us look at the way that the statements will be executed. So what process 0 would do is it will set flag 0 equal to 1. Process 1 will also do the same. Then what process 0 will do is that it will set turn equal to, so there is a catch over here, so this will not be 0, this will be 1. Similarly, process 1 will set turn equal to 0. Alright, so that is the catch over here, that one sets it to 1 and the other sets it to 0. So with no loss of generality, let us assume that turn was set to 0 first and then it was set to 1. Right? So given that it is a shared variable, one of the writes will happen before the other. So let's assume we set it to 0 first and then we set it to 1. So we will have an ordering like this. After that, we claim that process 1 entered the CS and process 0 also entered the CS. CS meaning the critical section. So for process 0, what would have happened? This test would have proven to be correct because turn has been set equal to J, turn will remain as J because there has been no intervening write. So this was clearly true. So given that we exited the while loop, clearly it must have seen flag J, which for it is flag 1 equal to false. Otherwise it would not have entered the critical section. So given that it entered the critical section, it must have seen flag 1 equal to 0, which means that this check for entering the critical section, this check must have happened before flag 1 was set equal to 1. So what you see over here, very interesting, you see that there is a cycle. This is a cycle of happens before relationships, which basically goes like this, again back, right? So you can never have a cycle of happens before relationship. So this is impossible, right? So impossible, I'll write it in a slightly calligraphic ink. This is absolutely impossible. That a cycle of happens before edges, where the first event needs to happen before the second, this cycle cannot form. Okay, such a cycle cannot form. Okay. Given that such a cycle cannot form, we have a contradiction. Consequently, we say that this algorithm provides for mutual exclusion. right? So mutual exclusion is a part of this algorithm. All right, so now that we have seen this, the key CS requirement has been met. We just were able to prove that mutual exclusion is preserved. The progress requirement is also preserved because if, let's say, one process is in the critical section, the other one is waiting, once I set flag I equal to false, for the other process, this test would become false, right? For the other process, this test will become false, so it will quickly enter the critical section. And similarly, bounded waiting requirement is also met, primarily because if once the other process is done, you get the chance. So for a two process system, this actually works, this algorithm actually works very well. Okay, this is known as the Peterson's lock. There are of course some problems, but this by and large works very well. There are extensions for n process solutions as well. They are known as the filter lock and the bakery lock. Okay, so they solve the problem for n processes as well. So although this algorithm is very useful, the main problem is that the code for the Peterson lock does not really work on modern processors. So there is an issue. That is the reason the code does not work on modern processors. Understanding why it will not work is very important. Of course, if we have a single thread, there is no problem. But on any multi-threaded processor, on any modern core, there are issues. What are the issues? See, the modern architecture, what happens is the moment two threads actually share data, and let's say one thread writes x equal to 100, then it writes flag equal to true. Right, so this is thread 2. Thread 1, what it does is it waits as long as flag is false, it just waits. And then it prints the value of x. So what you would expect is that flag, assuming it was initialized to false, well, this statement would execute, then this, and then this. You would expect the output to be 100. But that is actually not the case in many modern architectures. The main reason being that when you have multiple cores, other cores may perceive a different order of writes to different addresses. So I just want to repeat, another core may perceive updates to different addresses in a different order as compared to the original thread. So original thread in this case is thread 2. What it is perceiving is that x was set to 100 first and then flag was set to true, whereas in this case thread 1 might perceive a different order, which will lead you to the intuitively wrong output. Alright, so given the fact that the intuitively wrong outputs are genuinely allowed in modern architectures, there is a problem because even the Peterson lock, if you go back to the little proof that we had, here we are relying on the fact that from the point of view of all threads, this statement executes first, then this, and then this. And our proof incidentally did rely on this fact. So our proof relied on the fact that first we set flag, then turn, then we enter the CS, then, so this happens, this is done for both the threads. But let's say if this ordering doesn't hold, in the sense that the compiler either reorders these two instructions or the processor reorders these instructions, then of course the algorithm will be violated. The Peterson's lock algorithm will get violated, and that's the reason this will not work. So what you should do, or rather I would say must do, is that between these instructions, so let's say after you set flag 1 is equal to true, flag IE let's say, you insert an instruction called a memory barrier, and then you set turn is equal to j. So what the memory barrier basically does is that it ensures that regardless of the architecture, the hardware and the compiler will not reorder these instructions. This instruction, the flag instruction, will execute first, and then the turn instruction will execute later. The price that you pay is that you have to insert a memory barrier instruction, which not only is an additional instruction, but it is also very expensive in terms of performance, right? So in terms of performance, you do not want such instructions, and such instructions are also known as fences. Okay. So of course there are memory models. Every machine, every processor defines something called a memory model, which says which instructions can be ordered and with respect to each other. So of course memory models do define strong ordering and weak ordering. Strong ordering basically means that when a modification by one processor is immediately visible to all other processors, including in the same order, we say that it is strongly ordered. But in weakly ordered, what can happen is that different accesses by the same processor, so let's say to different memory addresses, not to the same but to different memory addresses, can be seen by other processors in different orders. So this is why algorithms like the Peterson lock will not work unless the variables are declared as volatile in C or Java, then it will work. So volatile variables. So of course C, the semantics is not very clear in the sense C++ does define something called atomics. So if you define this as an atomic integer, that is what you should do, then of course the order will be preserved. But in Java, the volatile keyword will work. This indicates to the compiler that the ordering has to be preserved. Or let's say if you have access to assembly code, so in general to insert a memory barrier or a fence, access to assembly code is required. So if access to assembly code is there, then it will force, then what it will do is that the barrier will ensure that the instructions before the barrier fully complete are visible to all processors before any instruction after the barrier starts. So in that sense, it's like a fence. So a barrier incidentally is also called a fence. And a barrier in parallel terminology means something slightly different, but we'll come to it later. Alright, so this is just a repetition of what we discussed in the previous slide, that prior to a barrier, all instructions are visible to everybody else, so prior to a barrier, all the instructions need to fully complete before any instruction after the barrier is started. Example of a memory barrier in this case, in our case with the flag and X. So while not flag, so then we set a memory barrier and then we print the value of X, and similarly the other thread, between the two accesses, it introduces a memory barrier call. Alright. So many of these facilities in Linux systems are provided. You can look at GCC intrinsics. You can just Google for it. So GCC intrinsics will provide you functions that are wrappers to the assembly calls for the barrier and fence operations. So if let's say a barrier is introduced, then of course the ordering between X and flag is being preserved. Similarly, the ordering between while not flag and print X is being preserved, and that is why this code is going to work. So of course, see, issues like the memory model or memory consistency are much better handled in a course on advanced architecture. So I would suggest all of you who do not have a background to look up any book on advanced architecture, including mine, which discusses these topics in great detail. So now let's look at hardware solutions. Okay. So what have we seen up till now? In uniprocessors, single core systems, we have looked at one solution which does work and incidentally does work rather well, which is to disable interrupts. Fine. So then, if there's a single core, then you will never have an issue because a lock function can be supported in the kernel, where all that the kernel will do is it will, once one thread is there, it will disable the interrupts and allow it to either enter the critical section or queue itself. So we have seen that. Multiprocessors, it's too inefficient, so we will need something else. We will need atomic variables and hardware instructions. So let's look at what these are. So special hardware instructions that allow us to test and modify the content of a word or atomically do a swap are required. So there are various instructions like compare and swap and test and set. So let's look at them. So all these instructions appear to execute instantaneously. So let's look at this test and set instruction, which of course the instruction is not a function, but the function is showing what the instruction is supposed to do. So let's say you give it a Boolean target. So it reads the value of the target. So star target is essentially a memory address. This is indicating the fact that to the instruction you send a memory address. You read the value of the memory address. You set the value at the memory address to true. Alright. And you return the value. You return the old value. So what are you doing? You are basically doing a load over here. So this is also your essential, or let's say you are doing a read and then you are doing a write. You can also modify the value and write, but let's say you are doing a write and you are returning the value that has been read. And all of this is being done atomically, in the sense it appears to any outsider that this piece of code is executing instantaneously. And we are returning the original value of the passed parameter, and we are setting the value of the memory address here to true. So how can atomic instructions such as test and set be used to implement lock and unlock functions? So let's say that there is a shared Boolean variable lock which is initialized to false. No problem. So here is what we do, and we are assuming that test and set, of course, it is showing up here as a function, but within the function it is a single assembly instruction. So that is important, right? It's not many instructions, it's a single one. And something to the effect of test and set is already provided by GCC intrinsics. So what we do is that we, given a lock variable, we assume that if let's say 0 is stored in it, 0 being false, then it is free. Otherwise, we say that it is not free. So what we try to do to acquire the lock is that, of course, we send the address of the lock variable. We try to set it to 1 and we return the previous value. So if the previous value was 1, it means that some other thread had acquired the lock and we are not the ones to acquire it, right? So that is what it means. So it means that we are not the ones who set the value from 0 to 1. Given that we are not the ones, it clearly means we didn't get the lock, so we do nothing and we keep on iterating. So this is a while loop that just keeps on iterating. But once the return value of this is 0, which means that we set it from 0 to 1, we enter the critical section, and after leaving it, we set lock to false. That's pretty much all that is done. There is nothing more to this. It is as simple as this, that we set lock to false. Of course, modern implementations are far more complex than this, but this is a very simple skeletal implementation. Does it solve the critical section problem? Yes, it does. Is it the most efficient? Not necessarily. So we will discuss one more instruction called compare and swap. So what compare and swap does is that given an address, it has an expected value and a new value. So atomically all of this executes. It reads the value from the address. If the value stored in the address is equal to the expected value, right, then the value is set to the new value. Okay, and then we return the previous value. So it's also called compare and set in some cases, where what we return is we return the previous value, and also we return in this case, if let's say the expected is equal to the real value, then we set the value at the address to the new value that we are sending. So this also can be used to implement a critical section lock. Similar to test and set. So this is not necessarily more efficient because it does involve more work, but this is more efficient when we are implementing other algorithms. So what we do is we send the address, and we say that look, if the existing value is 0, then you set it to 1, because that's what we want to do. To acquire a lock, if it's unlocked, we want to lock it 0 to 1. And then we look at the previous value. Okay, so if the previous value is equal to 0, this means we have gotten the lock. Good news, we get out of the loop. Otherwise, if it's not equal to 0, we keep on iterating. Fine, then we enter the critical section, and finally to unlock, we set lock equal to 0. So we can do a few more things with compare and swap. So one of this is called bounded waiting. So here is the code for it. So for process I set waiting I is equal to true. I set key equal to 1. So as long as waiting is I, in the sense I am waiting and the key is equal to 1, I try to do a compare and swap. So what do I do a compare and swap with? So compare and swap is that I take the lock address, and then if it is 0, I try to make it non-zero by swapping it with 1. So the moment that the value of the key becomes equal to 0, it means that I was the one who set the value of the lock from 0 to 1. So then I come out and I say that look, I am not waiting. Fine. So this means that at this point I am in the critical section. So in the critical section, what do I do? So what I do is that I take a look at the next process, which is the process after me. So the process that is after me is j, which is I plus 1, percentage n, because I want to loop back. As long as j is not equal to I and j is not waiting, I keep incrementing j. These two lines basically mean that if, let's say, I am process I and I am arranging all the processes as a circular queue, I keep on walking this circular list or queue, whatever you may call, until I find a process j which is actually waiting for the lock, right? And of course, if I don't find a process j, I'll come back to myself and I'll set the lock equal to 0, which means I'll free the lock. Otherwise, what I will do is that I will do my work. So that of course I'm not showing, but I will do all the work that I need to do. Then I will set the value of waiting j to false. So this is like kind of passing the token. So as you can see, this is one example where what I am doing is that I am acquiring the lock, fair enough. And then what I am doing is I am doing my work, whatever I am supposed to do. And that is not being shown in this code. And then what I am doing is I am walking through the array of waiting processes to find the next process that is waiting for the lock. In this case, it is j. And I'm setting waiting j equal to false, which in a sense will release process j, and it will basically, it will be able to do its work. All right. Okay. So basically what it would be able to do is that the lock would still be acquired. The status of the lock will still be equal to 1. Because I had set it to 1, see, if I is not resetting it, instead what I is doing is I is passing on the token to j, and then j is working and j is passing on the token to somebody else, let's say k. And finally, if let's say no other processes are found which are waiting for the lock, then only you set it to 0. So this is one way of actually processes helping each other with the lock. And mind you, there is a bounded wait, because if let's say I have set waiting equal to true, sooner or later I am guaranteed to get the lock, because no process will get into the critical section twice without me getting in. So this is, consider this as a fair locking mechanism. This is a simple piece of code, but kindly go through this slide over and over and over again several times at least, until this piece of code is understood, right? So until this piece of code is totally understood, there is a need to go over this slide many times. All right. So what is the key idea? Well, there are two difficulties that students face in this slide. One difficulty is that if I finds a process j mind you, it is not unlocking it. The status of the lock is still 1, which means nobody else can get in, right? Then I is deliberately enabling J, which means that J will still not, so this line will not be successful for J, but J will still be in the critical section, because waiting J will become false. Alright, pretty much. After that, it will do its job. Again, it will transfer. The lock will still remain 1. The lock becomes 0 when the process that has the lock is not able to transfer it to someone else. So this is a cute and neat piece of code that does this piece of work. That implements a bounded wait. Many other instructions are there. For example, one of the software and hardware tools is something called an atomic variable. An atomic variable is something which can be incremented or decremented atomically, which means that either all of it appears to happen or none of it, and that increment or decrement appears to happen instantaneously. So given that this is the case, so I'll tell you what will not happen instantaneously. If it's not atomic, and let's say you want to do x plus plus where x is a shared variable, what internally the machine will do is that it will save x in a register, it will increment the register, and then it will set that to x. So it will convert one instruction into 3 instructions. So it is very much possible that if there are 2 parallel calls to increment, in the sense 2 threads try to increment x at the same time, both of them will read the same value of x. This instruction can also execute together, and they will end up writing the same value of x as well. In the sense, if x is 100, both t1 and t2 might end up with x equal to 101 and x equal to 101, which is clearly wrong. But if you make x atomic, this problem will not happen. So of course, some hardwares support atomic variables, but in general it's a software construct. So if I were to implement an atomic variable and have a function called increment, atomic int star v, pointer to an atomic variable, here is what I would do. I would have a do while loop. In the do while loop, I will say that let temp be the value of the variable as long as I am not able to compare and swap. What am I not able to compare and swap? So let v be the address. Okay. So let the address be v as long as I am saying that I was not able to increment, or let's say find the address of v to be temp and increment it to temp plus 1, I will continue to loop. So when will I exit this loop? When I'll exit this loop when I find the old variable to be equal to temp. As you can see, the old variable, or let's say the value at this location is equal to temp, and I successfully set it to temp plus 1, then I will leave it. And whenever I leave this loop, this is equivalent to an atomic increment. Alright. So this is one nice way. So of course this stuff is kind of slightly complicated. So I would request you to go over this several times, because of its inherent complexity. Nonetheless, the key point here is that we might have many threads that are competing to increment the same variable. In this case, the compare and swap instruction is being used, but what we are doing is that we are reading the old value, writing a new value, and checking that we indeed read the old value. Alright, so we'll now come to mutex locks, where a lock is essentially something that we have been discussing, but it does get more sophisticated than that. So every lock has a lock function also called an acquire, and a release function also called release. Both acquire and release are atomic. And this solution does require busy waiting, in the sense if you are not able to acquire a lock, there is a need to go round and round and round in a while loop. So this is also known as a spin lock, or it's called busy waiting. So solution to the CS problem using mutex locks, well, you acquire critical section release. So but as I said, simple locks are good, but they do get more complicated than that, right? So you can have more expressive constructs, right? Not just a simple lock, but you can have a semaphore as well, which is a more expressive construct. So every semaphore has two basic functions, wait and signal. So they were originally called P and V, but we shall use wait and signal. So wait on a semaphore basically says that as long as the count associated with the semaphore is less than or equal to 0, okay, then we just busy wait, we just wait. So whether we busy wait or we wait via some other mechanism, this we shall see. Because in modern systems, you busy wait for some time. After that, you request the kernel to swap you out. Alright. So if let's say the count exceeds 0, then of course we don't enter this while loop. Instead, we just decrement the count and we get out of the wait. The signal operation does the reverse. Of course, there is no waiting involved, where we just increment the count, and that too atomically. So atomically we increment the count. And in the wait case, atomically we decrement the count. So there are two kinds of semaphores, a counting semaphore, where of course the count can be over a very large domain, or a simply binary semaphore 0, 1, which is the same as a lock. So binary semaphore in this case is exactly the same as a lock, and it turns out that a counting semaphore, which is useful in many scenarios, particularly when in a producer-consumer kind of scenario where the consumers are waiting and waiting. So let's say there's a shared queue and there are a couple of producers that are producing items, couple of consumers are consuming. That's typically where you would use a semaphore. So a counting semaphore can be implemented with a lock-unlock kind of mechanism. So semaphore usage, so we can create a semaphore mutex that is initialized to 1, and all that we can do for implementing a lock is wait on the mutex, a binary semaphore, wait and signal. That's all. What we can do is we can consider processes 1 and 2 with statements S1 and S2, where the requirement is that S1 needs to happen before S2. Then what we can do is that after S1 we do a signal, and then before S2 we do a wait. So this would ensure an order between S1 and S2, subject to the fact that other instructions are not using this semaphore. Alright. So the signal wait mechanism can be used to enforce an order, okay, between S1 and S2, because if let's say this process arrives here first, it would increment the count to 1. Then if P2 comes here later, it will decrement it to 0. If P2 comes here first, it will find the count to be 0, it will wait until signal increments it to 1, and then quickly P2 will decrement it to 0. So the implementation of critical sections as well as the implementation of this order is important, right? These are important pieces of code, and that's where semaphores are used. And furthermore, as we have said, busy waiting is often not a very good solution, because applications may spend a lot of time in critical sections, even though this is not desirable. So we should be in search of a better solution. So with each semaphore, what we do is we associate a waiting queue, a queue of processes. Each entry in the waiting queue will have two things, a value which is of type integer and a pointer to the next record in the list, which is similar to any other waiting queue. And furthermore, we'll have two operations, block and wake up. So block basically means that whichever process is invoking an operation, we place it in a waiting queue. And wake up is that we remove one of the processes in the waiting queue and we place it in the ready queue. So of course, when we are dealing with processes and you want to block processes, wake up processes, put them in the ready queue and so on, So here of course the kernel support is required. So this is where semaphores need to be implemented in the kernel, where instead of a busy wait which essentially eats up CPU time without doing anything productive, and it is not power efficient as well, what we can instead do is that a process can block, put itself in a waiting queue, and the wake up operation will just wake up one of the waiting processes. So in a waiting queue, this is how we can define a semaphore. The semaphore, needless to say, will have a value which is incremented atomically, and we'll have a list of processes implemented as a linked list. So the wait function, what it would do atomically, so it will decrement the value. If the value is less than 0, then we'll add the current process to the linked list and we will block. Everything done within the kernel. And the other blocking solution for signal is that we first increment the value. If the value is still less than equal to 0, right, so then, there is a small correction here. This is not less than equal to, it is greater than. So what we do is that we increment the value. If the value is greater than 0, then what we do is we remove a process P from the list and we just wake it up. Alright. So what is done in this case is that we remove a process P from the list and we wake it up. And this less than equal to is not correct, it should be greater than. Alright, so this is what is done and a process is woken up. Incorrect use of semaphore operations. So of course, if we omit a signal or a wait, or let's say their ordering is not correct, then it is possible that we might be waiting forever, right? And so because of this, there is a need to properly verify code with logs as well as semaphores, semaphores being more expressive in this case. So we'll next discuss monitors. So a monitor is a very convenient and effective mechanism. It's an abstract data type. So all the internal variables are only accessible by the code within the procedure. So we define a procedure and we designate it to be a monitor. So the advantage of the monitor is that within this function, only one process can be active within the monitor at a time. Or let's say what we can do is we can take a set of procedures. A procedure is a function. And furthermore, we can say that within this set of functions, only one process can be active at a time. So it is not just limited to one piece of code. It can be several pieces of code, but only one process can be executing any of this at any point of time. That's called a monitor. So what is the schematic view of a monitor? The schematic view is that we have a bunch of code, we have a bunch of data, and some code to also initialize all of this. This entire box of code is essentially executed by a single process at a single point of time. So we basically have a linked list of processes that execute. So this is nothing but a linked list. Alright. So they execute the code in the monitor. Alright. So the advantage is that this is even more expressive than a basic lock and a semaphore. So in this case, what happens is that we are protecting a large amount of code, which in a sense does benefit us in the sense that we can take a lot of like semi-related functions, put them all in one monitor and ensure that they are all thread safe. That means concurrent threads are not accessing it. Well, thread safe actually means more. It means that even if concurrent threads are accessing it, it is correct. But let's use it in this context that only one process is accessing it. So then monitor implementation using semaphores, well, I can define a mutex for every procedure. I'll simply define a mutex of this type, wait and signal. Okay. And all that this is going to do is that you first wait to get the lock, and once you exit the lock, you signal. Next, let us discuss condition variables. So condition variables are essentially smart variables where along with every variable we have a wait and signal function. So the moment you call wait on a condition variable, So condition variables are more of a Java kind of construct. The moment a process invokes an operation on a condition variable such as wait, it is suspended until signal, and the moment you call signal, it resumes one of the processes that invoked wait. And clearly, if there is no wait on that variable, then there is no effect. So you can think of the condition variable as like a single meeting point, where basically what you do is that you call wait first, then somebody else comes and signals you on the variable. So it is slightly different from a semaphore in the sense semaphores always have history, they always maintain a count, and whenever the count exceeds 0, one of the processes is woken up. This is slightly different. So here you say that look, I will wait, then you signal me. If let's say I signal a variable for which nobody is waiting, then clearly there is no value. So you can have a monitor with condition variables. So you could have queues associated with conditions, right? That also could be done. So usage of condition variables, an example. So consider processes P1 and P2 that need to execute statements S1 and S2, where the order is that S1 first and S2 later. So what we can do is we can create a monitor with functions F1 and F2. Then what we do is we set a condition variable X that is initialized to 0 and a Boolean variable done. So F1 encapsulates statement S1, and then the done variable will be set to true, and then we signal. In F2 what happens is that it first checks what is the value of the done variable. Say the done variable is true, it means that S1 has executed, so it will execute S2. So far so good. But if the done variable has not been set to true, it will basically wait. So it will wait for the signal operation to finish, and then the waiting operation will resume from there. Alright. So what was the key idea over here? The key idea over here is that if a waiting thread comes, then it first checks this variable, and if it is false, it means that the original operation has not completed. So it just waits. So here is the fun part. So why did we have them in a monitor? The reason we had them in a monitor, so we encapsulated both of these in a monitor, is basically because if we consider the ordering of the statements here, what we want is that after S1 is done, we want done to be equal to true. But depending upon the memory model of the machine, this may not be true. So if we have a monitor, then it will at least ensure that all of these three statements are fully executed, and then the process leaves the monitor. So it ensures atomicity of these three instruction blocks. Okay, so that's the reason we use a monitor. And once this is done, then of course the same process or another process, it doesn't matter, can come in. It can check that the value of done is false. If that is the case, it just waits. And the moment that you wait, you leave the monitor, right? So this is one fine print that should be borne in mind, that the moment you wait, you actually let go of the monitor. And then some other function comes. When it signals, you again come back and you try to grab the monitor once again. And then you will see that look, done is, then once the fact that you are woken up, it basically means that a signal has happened. So you will execute statement S2. So what we do see over here, that there are many subtle interactions between threads, which normally we will not be able to guess. We'll just say that look, it is 3 lines, so it must be simple. But that is not the case. So we can have a lot of subtle interactions between threads because parallel activities are taking place. So here, for example, it is necessary to encapsulate both in a monitor and have the signal wait mechanism as is being shown here for S1 to execute first and S2 later. Let us now look at the implementation of a monitor that also uses conditional variables using semaphores as our base technology. So these are the 3 important variables that we will define. The first is a semaphore mutex, which is essentially the monitor mutex. To execute any function of the monitor, you have to grab onto this mutex, right? So there is no other option. Any function, first you get the semaphore mutex, then we talk. Semaphore next is slightly tricky. So mutex is essentially for entering any function. So if you don't enter, you remain outside. So let us say the mutex is for functions that are waiting outside, which means they have not entered the monitor at all. Whereas the semaphore next is for processes that are waiting inside. This basically means that let's say you are within a monitor, but then you are waiting for a conditional variable. Then technically speaking, you are within the monitor, so you don't need to grab mutex once again, but it is just that you are waiting inside. Something similar to what we showed in the last slide, if you would recall. This is what was shown, that the difference between waiting outside and waiting inside, that what you basically do is that you wait, you have x dot wait. So in this case, you are waiting on the conditional variable, but the point is you have kind of relinquished the lock for the monitor, because if you don't relinquish the lock, then nobody else will come in and nobody else will be able to signal you. So that is the reason you relinquish the lock, but still you remain inside, and once you are signaled, you can execute. So you don't need to grab the monitor lock once again. So that is why we differentiate between waiting outside and waiting inside. And the number of processes that are waiting inside, we say that this is next count. Alright, so that is a key difference. When do you wait inside? When you are waiting on a conditional variable, that is called waiting inside. So each function P is replaced by this code. So the first line, needless to say, is wait mutex, where you need to grab the monitor lock first before you actually come into a function. So that is wait mutex. Then you have the body of the function, the body of function P. After that, once you are done, you should give priority to functions that are waiting inside. So you check next count. If it is greater than 0, then needless to say, you signal next. Otherwise, you have no choice, but you give priority to functions that are waiting outside. That's the second preference. So then you signal mutex, and this basically means that anybody who is waiting outside can now come into the monitor. So this ensures mutual exclusion either way, because both the semaphores only allow one process to execute at a time. So mutual exclusion as such is ensured. Given that, let's bring in conditional variables into the picture and see how exactly they interact with the variables that we defined on the previous slide. So for each conditional variable x, what we do or the compiler does, it doesn't matter, but in most cases the compiler does, the library does, is that we associate a semaphore with the conditional variable x, so we call it xsem, which initially is 0. And the count also, the number of processes waiting on it, is also initially 0. So now we need to define two functions, x.wait and x.signal. So x.wait, this is the way that it looks. So when we are waiting, we first increment the x waiting count. So we make it plus plus, which means that look, I'm waiting on x. After I'm waiting on x, what you do is that you see if there is any other process which is waiting inside the monitor. So then if next count is greater than 0, which means there is indeed a process that is waiting inside, we signal that process. Otherwise, as we have seen on the previous slide, this piece of code being the same code is over here, that we then signal a process which is waiting outside. Alright, if you don't find something which is waiting inside. After that, what we do is we wait on the semaphore, wait xm, because you're waiting, right? Somebody needs to wake us up. And once this process is woken up, it decrements x count. So this is quite straightforward, where of course I always give priority to a process that is waiting inside within the monitor, as opposed to a process that is waiting outside. The operation x.signal is also on the same lines, quite simple. So it first checks x.count. So if x.count is greater than 0, then only we are in business. Otherwise, if there is no waiting process, the signal in this case has no meaning. Okay. So it's not the case for semaphores, but in this case it has no meaning. This has already been explicitly cleared on a previous slide. So only if it is greater than 0, we enter the code inside. So after that, what we do is that, so this is a blocking signal. I'll come to a second what it is, but we increment next count. So this basically means that we say that, look, now I am going to wait. So then I signal the semaphore. Okay. I signal the XM semaphore. So basically the wait was over here. It was waiting. And I signal it. And after that, what I basically do is that I wait on next. So I wait for somebody to wake me up, and then I decrement next count. So now I have erased the ink on this slide. The reason is that I want to focus on these two lines. So one question that students typically ask is that, look, I signaled, right? So what is the reason to wait? Why should I wait? So I have signaled, I have done my job, and then I should be allowed to execute. That is not correct. The reason is that the moment that you signal, this means that there is a waiting process, that you just woke up, right? So the waiting process woke up. So as of now, the waiting process has woken up and it is executing code in the monitor, right? See, if the waiting process is executing code within the monitor, then the current process, which has just signaled, that cannot execute code in the monitor, right? That's not possible. You can't have two threads or two processes executing code within the monitor at the same time. So given that the waiting process has woken up, the only option for the signaling process is to go to sleep. That is exactly what it does. At this point, it goes to sleep. So it waits on the next semaphore, which is essentially an internal wait. And then it waits for somebody to wake it up. And clearly when the waiting process exits, which is basically this point over here, if there is a process that is pending, it will signal it. Alright. And then what the current signaling process would do is that it would decrement its next count. Alright. So that is the key idea over here, that given that the waiting process has woken up, it will execute, but the current signaling process has to be in abeyance. Consequently, it's going to wait, and if no other process wakes it up, at least the waiting process, when it exits the monitor, it will wake it up. So taking this forward, a slightly more fundamental question over here is that after x.signal is executed, if there are multiple processes, which one should be woken up? So then wait can have, some arguments where you can say that maybe every process has a priority number, where the priority is provided in the wait function call itself. So we can choose the one with, let's say, the highest priority and wake up that function. So alternatively, what we can do is we can allocate, so let's say in resource allocation, we can do something similar. If let's say there are competing resources, they want access to a resource. So we can have a similar wait release mechanism. So here the idea is that we acquire a lock or we wait, and the priority that is given is the current time. And then we access the resource and we release. So clearly, if let's say the processes will get access to the CPU as per the current time, then the one with the lowest time should have the highest priority. In the sense, this is like a first come, first serve kind of order. So this will, as I said, if the time is being used as this, or let's say t can be the maximum time a process plans to use the resource. So in that case also, maybe we can say the one with the shortest time or one with the largest time, depending upon our priority, it can be given, or let's say the time can be the current time. Then in this case, the oldest request will be granted. So there are different options for what is this T, and that will provide for different scheduling policies. How to allocate a resource using a monitor? Well, that's not hard at all. So what we have is that we will define a condition variable. We will define a condition variable and a Boolean variable. So the acquire function, where the time is coming, this is the way it will work. If let's say the resource is busy, then we wait on the condition variable. Alright. After that, once we come out of the wait, then we set busy equal to true because we are deemed to have gotten access to the resource. And then when time comes to release it, we just set busy equal to false and we signal. That's all that needs to be done. And initialization code is that busy is false. So this kind of gives a nice example of how to use conditional variables along with monitors. So in this case, as you can see that both of them kind of are married pretty well, where we use the conditional variable to wait, and this would be an internal wait. And once done, we just signal and we leave. So we always can have incorrect use of monitor operations, in the sense we can have a release and then an acquire, that will have no effect. We can have an acquire and acquire, that will also be an incorrect usage. And let's say from an acquire, we don't have a matching release, that would also be an incorrect usage. So now we will have 2 or 3 slides about liveness. So liveness basically means that processes may have to wait indefinitely while trying to acquire a mutex lock or a semaphore. Waiting indefinitely can violate the liveness property. So liveness basically says that something good needs to happen all the time, which means that if I am waiting at a traffic light, then even if there is no accident, it means that ultimately I should see a green light. Ultimately I should be able to proceed. It should never be the case that only traffic along this road is going and not along the vertical road. So liveness means that ultimately I should get access to the lock. That's what liveness means. Deadlock means something else. So deadlock means that 2 processes are indefinitely waiting for each other. There is a circular wait. So we can have this. So let's say I wait on S and then I wait on Q, and the other one waits on Q and waits on S. Right? So then what would happen? I'm waiting on S. Okay. And then P1 is waiting on Q. So then what will basically happen is that we will have a circular wait over here. Why will we have a circular wait? Well, the circular wait we will have because both S and Q are initialized to 1. After the wait, both become equal to 0. Now if let's say this process is waiting on Q, it is waiting on this, so it is waiting on 0. And this process is again waiting on 0. So both of them cannot make any progress. Right? So you can clearly see that there is a circular wait because here there is a cycle that is forming, and basically none of the processes can make any progress at all, because the moment we reach here, wait Q is 0, so we are waiting, but there is nobody to release it because this process which was supposed to release Q is waiting on S and the value of S is 0. So this is a deadlock. So in a deadlock, nobody makes progress. In liveness, at least someone makes progress. Okay, you don't make, but somebody else makes. Right? So liveness essentially means that I should get access to the resource. Alright? And I am not going to wait indefinitely. And deadlock basically refers to this circular wait situation. There are other forms of deadlock, of course, where there is indefinite blocking, in the sense that a process may be removed from the semaphore queue in which it is suspended, and then there is nobody to wake it up, that is starvation. And then we can also have priority inversion, where a low priority process holds a lock that is essentially needed by a high priority process. So then what will happen is that the high priority process will have to wait for the low priority process to finish. So in this case, of course, we can either preempt or we can have something called the priority inheritance protocol. Let us come to the priority inheritance protocol. So it is defined over here. So let's say that process P1 has the highest priority, P2 has the next highest, and P3 has the lowest. Right? So in this case, what I do is that let's say that P3 is holding the semaphore S and P1 is waiting for P3 to relinquish the semaphore. Now what happens is suddenly process P2 is assigned the CPU because it has a higher priority than process P3. So what will happen is unnecessarily P1 will be waiting for P3, but P3 will not get scheduled because P2 has come in the middle and it is hogging the CPU, right? So in a certain sense, what is happening is that the very high priority process is waiting because of this particular corner case. So what we need to do over here is that the process P2, which has a lower priority than P1, has indirectly prevented P3 from finishing the job. So the priority inheritance protocol, what it will do is until process P3 has the semaphore, it will transfer process P1's priority to P3. That's what it will do. That until P3 is using the semaphore, it will run with a high priority, which is process P1's priority, in the sense that it will inherit the priority of the waiting process. So its priority will get jacked up. Then it will finish its job, and after that, process P1 will get access to the semaphore because it has the highest priority anyway. And once it finishes, P2 will get access. Alright, so after discussing that, we are now finally at the end of chapter 6. We discussed a lot of fun stuff, different ways of implementing locks. We discussed semaphores, we discussed monitors, and we also discussed the fact that look, monitors are most of the time used in conjunction with condition variables, because the reason is that to implement any complicated piece of logic, like let's say you want one function to execute before the other, and you want to kind of sequence commands or whatever, we have seen condition variables are very useful. But the moment you have condition variables along with monitors, it creates some interesting scenarios of waiting outside and waiting inside. So we did take a look at them, including corner cases. And then finally we did look at issues of deadlock and fairness. And the last slide was priority inheritance. So we'll discuss a little bit more of synchronization and move on to deadlocks after that in the subsequent chapters.